Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this lunchtime webinar, Navigating Risk, Financial Management and Young Trustees. We're so excited for you to have taken the time to be here with us here today. We've got an incredible lineup for you. By the end of today, you would have heard from two amazing young trustees, have had a case study of a trust who has seen the tangible impacts that young trustees have had on their board and drawing on their experiences from someone who is a trustee and a director. We'll be answering your specific questions. Thank you everybody who has submitted your pre-submitted questions so far, and for any questions that you're going to come up with. And we'll also be giving you tangible next steps. So you will leave here with some practical next steps of things that you can practically do. And most importantly, you will not leave here alone, but you will be joined here with others who've making the time to join today to figure out how they can support young trusteeship and understand why young trusteeship on the boards of trusts and foundations and funding organisations is so important and vital to navigating risk, financial analysis, and ensuring that we can future-proof our organisations. Well, joining with, and to introduce myself, I always forget to do that. My name is Mita, welcome. I was a trustee at 21, a chair of a board at 25, and I currently manage the Young Trustees movement. And our mission is to double the number of young trustees by 2024. And we're supported and incubated by the Social Change Agency. I'd like to introduce our first guest and panelist, Afshan. Welcome, Afshan.
Hey, hello.
Hello. So you tell us about yourself, and what you do and why you're here.
Wow, who am I? What do I do? So I'm a playwright and poet, and I work in the arts. And I'm also a Northwest ambassador for the Young Trustees movement. I sit on a couple of boards. I sit on Manchester Literature Festival's board and Pi Radio's board, and I work in sort of consulting with Langley Chase Foundation in Greater Manchester, looking at systems change. That's
Thank
me.
you. And you have been, since the age of 23, you have been a trustee, and you've also worked for a lot of funding organisations. And in your role as an ambassador for the Young Trustees movement, you get to choose a campaign and lead a campaign in an area that you're passionate about and you think that there needs to be change in. And you chose to explore your campaign on the area focused on how the funding sector can be part of that change, and what that means for power and what it means to create better, more innovative governance. Can you tell us a bit more about this campaign and why you chose it?
So basically, I've been working in the arts my entire life, and I kept seeing that the boards and the organisations were not representative of the communities that they seek to serve. And that really, first of all, frustrated me. And secondly, I realised actually it's a power imbalance. There's a lot of risks that those organisations are taking on because they're creating programmes, they're designing projects, and putting stuff out there without actually having anybody with lived experience from the communities actually on their boards sort of influencing those decisions. So I was sort of, seeing that and then looking at movements within tech specifically around design and design diversity and how, they're encouraging more young people, women and diverse people to sit on those boards to encourage sort of like diverse tech to emerge. Most famously, Apple did this with where they completely forgot that some people have periods, and they forgot that from the health cycle of the watch. So that, there was a change needed there. I guess in terms of funders, I feel like there's a lot of influence that funders have over the organizations that they fund, and they can lead by example. And I think a good way of doing this is to sort of showcase how their own boards can be diverse, racially, but also in terms of like age diversity, and to sort of influence other organizations to maybe implement board terms in their organizations, to have maybe like 3-year board terms or 5-year board terms to encourage sort of like newer and fresher board members in there, to give an opportunity for the organizations to grow, but also for young people and for people on the boards to grow. and to network more.
Thank you. And why do you think a diversity of lived experience is relevant to key things like financial management and risk analysis and governance?
I think it goes down to like what programs we're doing and what programs that are being created. And I think that an organization can remain completely white, male, and straight, right? And then suddenly the world isn't that way. And when you're creating programs, when you're doing things, you can end up making an entire program stand that you assume a community is going to want and a community is going to engage with. And more often than not, they don't want to engage with that because it's either missed the ball or it's a stereotyped understanding of what that community looks like or exists like or believes or wants. And that's where the issue arises. And I think as soon as you then have more representation on the board and you have diversity in terms of age and ethnicity and gender, you'll have more of those conversations taking place. You know, somebody will stop and go, actually, I don't think that's an appropriate program to have, or actually, I don't think this is a great way to do the strand because, you know, not everybody from this X community believes this way, or things have moved on, or things have changed, or maybe even like, have you thought of adding in an additional strand to help these people in these communities to engage with our programs and projects? And I think that's it. It goes down to that. There's a lot of kind of, you know, anecdotal examples of local governments that have sort of built massive buildings, you know, for the community and spent like millions and millions of pounds on them, and then nobody comes to them and they're like, why is nobody coming? And the first question you want to ask is, well, did you consult anybody? Did you consult any of the people in the communities? Did they want this? And the answer is often no, they just assumed. And that's a massive risk. That's millions and millions of pounds that are being lost that could have been put into other programs that the community actually wants and needs and desires.
Thanks, Afshan. And in your recent blog, you spoke about the importance of it's not just important to have these people, you know, existing in these spaces, but you really need to have boardrooms that enable people to thrive in these spaces. So the diversity of perspectives and real power of what can come from that can be really heard and realized. And in that you speak about how it's really important to not be tokenistic, and therefore why it's important to have more than one young trustee. Could you expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, so I have a policy that's like based on a Stormzy lyric. Stormzy, if you're watching this, hey, it's take that.
I'm sure he is. He's actually a young trustee, obviously. By the way. Fun fact.
Just call me later, Stormzy. Yeah, cool. So the lyric is take that fee and treble it twice, and it's this idea that actually we, and as people of color, as women, we often undersell ourselves to begin with. And actually, I realized through my experience in boards and being in organizations, being the only woman of color, being the only non-white person in those spaces, the amount of burden of representation that falls on me is a lot, and it can lead to burnout. And the policy that I have is that I find the only person of color, or the only woman of color, the only queer person that's sat on a panel and I'm being asked to represent my identity, that they either double my fee or they bring another person in of a similar identity onto the panel. And that's just to allow for more space for me to be able to vocalize my own experiences without it being generalized to my own race, to my entire race or my entire ethnicity or gender or sexuality. And I think it's a really great way of doing things. I think rather than just having one young trustee, you know, if you have two young trustees, can you imagine, like, you'll have, you know, double the amount of knowledge coming in, because not all young trustees have the same knowledge. It's the same with women. If you have more than one woman on a panel, I really hope you do, or on a board, you know, then you'll have, like, you know, loads more experience coming in, because not all women are the same, and so on and so forth. So there's a definite benefit to the organizations once they have multiple perspectives coming in from a particular identity. But as a person, as a jobbing writer, as someone who sits on panels and boards, it's a policy that I've implemented and it's done really well. So either pay me double the fee or bring in somebody else. Yeah.
Thank you, Afshan. And we've already had some great questions coming in towards you. Just a reminder to everybody who's attending, this webinar is made for you. So please do ask the questions that you want to be asked. You can do that in the Q&A function. And you can also like questions that you want to be most asked. And we'll also be following up resources and support you get to ensure that you have all of your questions answered. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our second panelist, Angus. Welcome, Angus.
Hi, Mita. How are you doing?
Hello, good, and great to have you on the panel. You are the Charity Niche Director at the Ecclesiastical Insurance Group, and your day job focuses on specialist insurance and financial services.
They're very exciting.
It's very exciting indeed. How did this lead you to focusing on young trustees?
Well, Ecclesiastical, while it's an insurance company, it's actually owned by a grant donating charity. So there's a bit of commonality there. And because of that background, we want to get to know our customers better, not just from an insurance perspective, but also supporting the sector. So we do lots of research and we try and get close and discussion panels similar to this. One of the things that we did notice is that diversity was sort of coming up the ranking. And that's even before last year with sort of Black Lives Matters and all the rest of it. There was a lot of, I think there's been a lot said about ethnicity and gender and all the rest of it. But one area that kind of did prick our interest was that age profile. So that we decided that we would sort of come from it from a different angle. And we're in the risk business, insurance company. And I thought it was really also interesting was that when you take a step back and sort of look at the profile or the caricature of a trustee, of an age, probably white, professional, the rest of it, you start thinking about the sustainability and the longevity of trustees. And then also the knock-on effect about, well, what kind of decisions, are they going to be good decisions, bad decisions, or, what are the decisions when you've just got a one view of the world? So that's how we kind of gravitated into this area about sort of young trustees on the trustee board. What does that mean for risk? What does that mean for the success of the organisation? And as pointed out just previously, also was interesting from our point of view because we give grants. Are we challenging ourselves? No, probably not. So that's how we got here, Mita.
Thank you, and that is so interesting. And often we have this idea that well, I certainly did before I was a trustee, that trustees are these kind of mythical, all-knowing people that somehow have the magical knowledge to solve these problems. Like I genuinely thought that just trustees were on a whole different level, but really they're just human beings doing the best they can. Exactly. And therefore, by having those diversity of perspectives, as you mentioned, is so essential to the management of risk, to understand the uncertainty that we face. So in your coming back to the research that you commissioned on young trustees, what were the things that you found were most interesting from that research?
I think it splits down into two areas. There's kind of like the positives and the negatives, and I don't mean to be negative as just challenges, things that we need to think about. On the positive side, I think in many respects, we're sort of pushing at an open door. I think, young society, 18, 25, whatever age group you're in, I think they're way more engaged than they've ever been. And our research sort of backed that up, that, half the people we talked to wanted to be engaged, got engaged, but, most of the time it was through fundraising, volunteering, those sorts of things. When we dug a bit deeper, 20% said that they were, I never knew this, back to your point, never knew this was an opportunity. Which again, that's all great stuff. That gives us hope, that gives us the opportunities there. How do we capitalize on that opportunity? So that's kind of like, the up. The more challenging side, which was the other side of the flip coin, was that there was a percentage of people that had been a trustee, young people that had been a trustee, but they were no longer trustees. And I think that's kind of where you have this sort of look in the mirror type thing. So it varied, but of the ones that left, it was usually somewhere between 20 and 30%, had various reasons, but it was things like, I felt I was a tokenism. I wasn't listened to. I wasn't particularly meant to feel welcome or, sit over there, sort the biscuits out, that sort of thing. And that eventually led to frustration, also concerns about the direction that the charity was going in, and then them leaving the charity. So that's kind of like the downside, is that we had that opportunity, but it, to some extent, it's been a little bit squandered. So I think they were the sort of two big things that came out.
Right, and thank you for that. And that definitely matches what Afshan was speaking about beforehand in her campaign, and what she's focusing on. And it also is very much speaks to what the young people in the experiences that they're sharing, in the fact that not belonging or not feeling like you can participate fully in the room means that you're more focused on yourself and more focused on how can I fake it till I make it, or how can I belong in this space, rather than what's actually in front of you. And when a board culture has that in space, it makes it in place, it makes it much harder for them to be able to get the real value
I think the other thing is that everybody knows something. And going back to your point about if you're a young person, you might not be as confident as the other board members. And I think, the board has to recognise that and be more inclusive, more welcoming, seek out those alternative viewpoints so that you make not a polarised decision, but an informed decision from multiple viewpoints, so that it's better decisions, better charity organisations, better governance, and all the rest of it.
Right, and some of the biggest advocates I've seen of young trustees have actually had young people in their room, in their board meetings for maybe two board meetings. They've said maybe 3 words or a couple of sentences, and they have just been raving about the transformation in their board. And actually what's happened in that process is they've said, how can we make this inclusive for young people? And they've actually asked, well, how can we make it inclusive for everyone? How can we make the board papers more efficient? How can we ensure that people are prepped and have the training that they require to thrive in these spaces? And then all of a sudden you have innovated your governance to just be a lot more effective.
New level.
Yes, and you since I've known you in working on this project, you've always been so supportive, and always wanting to support the charity sector, particularly when we're often under-resourced, under so much pressure, and always have 3 million things to do. And we are often, and you said you don't want to wag the finger, but provide solutions to support them. And I often hear stories from frustrated staff and volunteers who can see that their charity desperately requires these younger insights to help them navigate solutions to challenging situations. But more often than not, they're faced with, oh, that sounds good, but we have more urgent and pressing priorities at the minute before focusing on board diversity. And so at a time of such uncertainty and challenge, is board age diversity a priority, Angus?
Right, okay. Well, I think I'm going to do sort of two things that I think the thing to ask yourself as a board, there's young people out there that want to help. Can you really turn them away? Is that a luxury you can afford? I think the other thing as well is society is not as accepting anymore. So again, that's a risk that's just been added to your risk register in some respects, okay? So that's two things, but going back more to the core of the question, I think you've got to, as a board, challenge yourself about having, this feels like it's down the priority list, but in actual fact, is it a challenge or a problem? Or actually, is it a solution? Okay? So you've got all these things that you need to sort out, but having that young person in the room, or multiple young persons in the room, is that actually going to be part of the solution for the other problems? And therefore it's actually more of a priority than you think. My background's risk, and risk's about identification, analysis, and control, and that's what it is. And Ash's already sort of leaned on it, is that probably one of the biggest risks when you're going through that journey of dealing with risk is that you get that one-dimensional view because everybody in the room looks, feels the same. They come from the same background, they come from the same section of society and all the rest of it. When we talk about risk, we talk about risk horizon scanning. Where's the risk coming from and all the rest of it? Now, to try and make it simple to get in your head, if you're scanning the horizon and everybody in the room looks and feels the same, they're probably all looking in the right direction. They're probably all looking south, okay? But that horizon is 360 degrees. It goes right around you. And the risk bus could come from any direction, okay? If you bring young people in, you bring in fresh blood, fresh ideas, fresh perspective, fresh views on life. That means that you're going to be covering the full 360 degrees, not the 180, 90 aspect. And through that identification, analysis and control, again, you're getting new challenge, new ideas, different perspectives, and that can only ever lead to better decisions and better risk management. That is my gut feel.
Thanks so much, Angus. And I think when we look at the current situation, when less than 3% of trustees are under 30, there is a huge risk if nothing changes, and what is normal is not okay. So ensuring that we take leadership there is really key. Thank you, Angus. And introducing Osaro, who is a young deputy chair of the British Youth Council, a former trustee of the Ferns Educational Trust, and a two-term president of Hull University Students' Union. Welcome, Osaro.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. It's really great to have you here. And as somebody who has been a young trustee of over a £5 million charity, what examples do you have of being able to add your insights as a young trustee in this way?
I think the first thing I'll say is that when I joined the board at Hull Students' Union, I was 21 years old, and just being a young person, and often a lot of young people feel like they don't have the confidence to contribute to the board. So I did find it quite intimidating, but in the end, I did enjoy my time at the board, and so I was able to contribute, give different insights. So what examples do I have? So at our Students' Union, you have a whole range of services for students. And unfortunately, we were going through quite a tough financial time for various range of reasons, including a drop in student numbers, historical fraud, and just a whole bunch of things. And so it was a tough time to be a trustee. And so one of the big things that I think as a young person, I and a lot of young trustees were able to help with was giving advice around the restructuring of our Students' Union. So when you're looking at the balance sheet and you're looking at what do you need to cut to help the charity be sustainable, I think when you're quite removed from the situation, so if you're not someone that has been part of the membership, so I was part of the membership because I was a student previously, if you're an external person, you may think, oh yeah, we should definitely cut that, but then you don't know the other reputational risks that come alongside with cutting certain services. So I think as a young person and all of the other young people on the board, having our general knowledge of what students desire, and then also having the knowledge of the external trustees, like a vast experience with finance, together we were able to decide on which parts of the SU we should remain invested in and which areas we should remove. So that included things like removing flagship events, or rethinking how we do things like our end of year ball or our welcome fest, or a housing service that we provided. That housing service, we realized that there were so many other people doing the same thing, so we didn't need to do it. So being able to have that insight as a student really helped the board make those types of decisions.
Right, thank you for that. And because trustee boardrooms should be a place, and I say should because it not always is, where boards are having to make different trade-offs and make those decisions, it's really important to have people young people in the room, and a diversity of perspectives in the room as well, in the ways that you said, particularly because there is a power in being able to choose between those trade-offs. And it would be really great to deep dive in your experience now, thinking about when you were a trustee of a trust. What examples do you have where, if the perspectives of young people were not in the room, how would there have been different decisions made, and where would there have been vital insights that would have been lost?
So my experience on the trust was very interesting. So I was there for a year when I was during my second term as president of the SU. And so I didn't even know we had this trust, which is another problem that I raised when I was there, because if you have this trust that are like giving money to students and staff for certain projects, and we need to be a lot more open and transparent in helping publicize that service, so that we can have a whole range of different people trying to get funding. So when I arrived on that trustee, that trust board, there was no students present on that board, which was interesting because, as I said, we're supposed to support staff and students. We did have a staff representative there, and then we had other external people who were either members of the board of the university council or other experts. So it seemed to be quite black and white with the type of decisions that they were making. So one of the examples, and it's an example that kind of touches on most of the areas that I think I was most effective in, was that most of the people that were sitting on that board, they were either working or retired, university educated like many years ago. And so you had really interesting, innovative proposals coming forward from students that seemed to be quite unconventional. And I felt like if I wasn't in the room saying, oh, this seems like a really great idea, and like trying to explain why this might be something that we should like take a chance on and give funding towards, those sorts of students wouldn't have had the opportunity to go ahead and undergo those projects. And those types of students, when I did look at the applications, they did seem to come from like a widening participation background. So, you know, not traditionally like white British people. It came from like a very, very diverse ethnic minority backgrounds. And so I thought it was important that I was able to contribute to that. And I felt like as I left that board, I wondered if there was another voice that would be able to like say those sorts of things, and if future students like those students that we were able to help would still have a chance, because the board wasn't as diverse in their thinking, in my own opinion. So I think that was one of the main areas I was able to make a difference on that board.
Yeah, thank you. And I noticed in that answer, you said nothing around social media. And a lot of the times young people are like, oh, maybe they can help us with our social media as a trustee in our strategy. But no, like,
it's funny you mentioned that, because they wanted to like jazz up their logo. So that was another area that we were looking at. So like social media logo presentation. So yeah, I was able to help out with that.
You also did the operational like sprucing up of the logo. Love it. But a lot of if we are just pigeonholing young people into this idea of you know, maybe help out in social media, then we're losing all the magic of diversity of perspectives that comes into the areas that you have mentioned. And side note, there is hundreds of sabbatical officers who are trained to be trustees, who are ready to go on to their next volunteering position, and a lot of them have really struggled to find volunteering positions. And there's a recent statistic that was out where over 70% of boards say they struggle with recruitment, and yet only 10% of boards advertise their trustee vacancies. So there's a great opportunity for boards to find people Definitely. Like Osaro. If you were to be so lucky. And so you also created the Make Diversity Count campaign, and you work as a consultant specialising in governance and EDI. Why is it important that the board as a whole create a space where diversity of perspectives can thrive?
So the Make Diversity Count campaign, it came from experiences of racism and discrimination that myself and other people around me experienced. And actually one of the main drivers for me to create that was my experience of racism on my board towards the end of my term as SU president. And so I think one of the biggest reasons why it's so important that ensuring diversity is the whole responsibility of the board, is that it doesn't just rest on the shoulders of one person that is like very passionate about diversity and inclusion, and it also helps everyone be more aware. If there are problems, if someone feels like there is a particular trustee that they're very close to and they're able to like speak out about feedback, it's important that everyone is just mindful that in this space we are all supposed to be equals, but there are other people who, for example, with my example, I was the only Black person that was on my board. There wasn't very many women on the board as well, and so the things that I experienced that weren't great, other people they weren't so aware about it because of their own backgrounds. And when I had like the strength to speak up about my own experiences, unfortunately, the people that I spoke about it to, they weren't very self-aware about EDI, or they didn't have like the appropriate training. So I think just on a human level, you need to ensure that every single trustee is comfortable in that space to speak up and contribute. And then also from like the charity perspective, if you ensure that diversity is able to thrive, then that will make sure that your charity is performing as best as you can, because you're getting the best out of everyone. So I feel very passionately about ensuring that diversity and inclusion is talked about a lot at board level, because if it's important to your charity or your trust, it needs to come from the top. It needs to be embedded in strategy, and the board is the best place to do it.
Thank you, Osaro, and sorry that you had to go through that, because clearly you were not only operating as a trustee in those experiences, but then you're having to, in that example that you mentioned, having to hold the burden of navigating so much, which really speaks to the research that we found, that Angus spoke about before, that actually people were leaving because of that sense of not belonging and feeling excluded. And so I think that links really nicely with introducing our fourth panelist, Segun. Welcome, Segun.
Hi, Mita.
Hi, and so you have been a trustee for Blagrave Trust, and you have had first-hand experiences and insights of a foundation board that has had young trustees for over 3 years. And as an international finance director for Restless Development, you obviously know something about finance, I'm guessing. And so it's great to have you here in this webinar focused on young trustees and financial management and navigating risk, because that is something that you see day to day. And just touching on Osaro's point in terms of it's really important to have boards who create these spaces where young trustees can really thrive. How did Blagrave as an organisation, as a trust, create the space where young people can thrive?
I think that Osaro mentioned it also a little bit, and so has Afshan already, but I think it's important to have more than one young trustee, and don't really call them young trustees, they're trustees as well, but having more than one, so you're also creating, you're shifting the culture and also the dynamic of the board in that way, and that also naturally creates a safe space. Afshan mentioned that she's often the only person of color and only female on the board, and so when there's a question that's aimed at in that, or a discussion that's around that area, all eyes will kind of go in that direction. And so where there's more than one young person on the board, it creates a safer space, and it just helps build trust to have a more open and open discussions. And then I think also it's important that how the boards are run and how the meetings are run, the formalities. Yes, we do need to have certain formalities as part of our governance and regulations, but it doesn't have to always be so formal, and creating that space to encourage discussions and inputs, and the chair of the board plays a really key and important role in making that happen.
Thank you, Segun. And having spoken to some of the young trustees on your board, one of the things that they often say is they really feel like their experiences are valued, and therefore the whole board doing that work in terms of thinking about, are we valuing the experiences, and have we done the work as a collective board to make sure that that diversity of perspectives can thrive, which really matches some of the research that we've done in some of our training and matching placement programs, where the biggest training and matching programs of young trustees, where the biggest difference between whether there would be a report on how effective the program was if the board had put in place and strategically thought about the kinds of things that you had done beforehand, rather than the young person coming in. So if the board is doing the work, that is going to be the biggest thing that is going to enable people to thrive. And speaking of young people thriving and getting the diversity of perspectives, what are the tangible benefits you have seen as a result of young trustees, and particularly in the sense of financial management?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that not just trusts and charities have, but even businesses have, is how do you communicate finance, and how do you communicate finance during a board meeting where you have a short window to kind of go through a lot of information. And so making financial information more accessible and easier to understand and focused, I think that's definitely one tangible benefit that I would say that having young trustees has helped push us towards that. And I think it's not necessarily just young trustees that need that anyway. I think that's a lot of trustees who put their hand up to that. And then just, I suppose also the big thing as well is that is financial management. A big part of financial management is there's 4 parts of it. So planning, monitoring, controlling, and organizing. And so having younger trustees, they also help with that, and being able to ensure that your value for money, and so being able to share insights that an organization or might have missed completely, which may have meant that a lot of money might have been wasted. And so that's a big tangible benefit. And I know that our Blagrave's Challenge and Change program, where we gave money to young individuals, that was about £80,000, I believe. But the impact and the benefit that the young people in the communities that they're working with had from that, I think that's a great example of a tangible benefit that having young trustees allowed us to do that and pushed us to do that as a board. And I'm sure Joe could probably talk a lot more on that.
Thank you. And I think one of the key things that we hear all the time from older trustees who have had young trustees come onto the board is that they've said to them, I'm so glad you joined, because I got to about 2 years in and I could not raise that I did not understand the financial accounts. And we were having these really short conversations. And actually, if the financial accounts and the conversations around financial management is made to be like rocket science, then you're losing the transparency and the whole point of governance in that space. And we often hear boards say they prepare to prioritise trustee candidates with more experience. And so while younger perspectives are helpful, they can get their perspectives maybe from an advisory board instead, or that because their service users are not limited to young people, they don't need intergenerational perspectives on their board. What would your advice be to those boards?
I would say that experience is good and it's helpful, but it's not essential. And especially in the world that we're living in today, it's changing so fast. Like, who was experienced for the last 12 to 18 months that we've just had? Very few, if not anybody. And so I think that it's important. Experiences, it can play a key role, but it can also be a hindrance as well, especially when we're talking around innovation and creation and potentially taking calculated risks. And so I think that that should boards should take that into consideration. And and also lived experience as well. I think that a young person that has got lived experience around a certain issue or a number of issues is just as valuable, and if not more valuable, than a professor that hasn't had lived experience but has got a lot of theoretical and knowledge and done a lot of reading around that issue. So I would say that.
Right, thank you, Segun. And it comes back to that point of, are we really valuing that knowledge? And what knowledge are we valuing? And that goes back to Afshan's point as well, in her blog that she had written for us. And if you're interested, check it out, where she said, you would need a PhD to understand the level of knowledge that I have from my lived experiences. So what is being valued there is always a key question that we often hear. I'd also like to bring in now Jo Wells, who is the director of the Blagrave Trust, into the conversation, as she has a long-term staff perspective of Blagrave and the impact that young trustees have had in that place. So Jo, Blagrave hasn't always had young trustees, and it was actually in 2017 they recruited 2 young trustees under 25. Why and how did the board decide to make this change?
Hi, Mita and everyone. Yeah, so the first thing is, like the Blagrave Trust when I joined 8 years ago was probably in a similar situation to many boards now, where we had a really undiverse board. Basically, it was all white and male and much older. So I guess there were 2 things. Maybe 3, the third being a quite tenacious chief exec who's willing to challenge a bit on some of these things. And I think to chief execs, that's important, actually. And I would say, really interestingly, I've had much more challenge from my board since it's become more diverse than I did when it was a more homogenous board. So just to say that is actually true and really important. So there was a recognition that we needed to diversify, but I suppose it was quite a gentle steps forward, let's get some women on the board, and let's kind of bring the average age down. But then the real driver in terms of young people was obviously our mission. We're a foundation that works for and with young people, and just the recognition that actually, reducing the distance between, the kind of power holders and the decision makers and the young people that we served felt really quite profoundly important, and that governance was key to that. This idea of proximity to the issues that we're trying to solve as a foundation, and how can a group of adults really have all or even some of the answers to those questions. So those 2 things kind of triggered the change. And then I guess, because I know there are lots of questions about, well, how do you start? And I think, you have to be quite pragmatic and kind of realistic about some of the trade-offs. So, we started recruiting 2 young trustees. First of all, we brought young people into the boardroom to kind of actually remove that distance and let trustees just meet young people who are activating, and working in the social change space, and kind of just realize, wow, there are some amazing young people out there. They could be on our board. And once that happened, actually very quickly, the trustees that had been resistant kind of got on board with the idea. But the first 2 trustees we had, they were quite well educated, and actually they were young. They were 19 and 18, incredible. But for some boards it may mean going a little bit older, where there's maybe a little bit more confidence. So I think just starting somewhere and just starting that journey, because then fast forward 4 years on in Blagrave, we've got 6 young trustees. The average age of our whole board is 32. And it's been a very quick snowballing. And people have touched on all of these things, but I'd say, recruit for skills. Like, there are millions of young people aged between 18 and 25 in this country, and many of them have many skills, whether it's in facilitation, finance, all sorts of things in the social change space. Don't recruit to just have a young person, because you get that situation where, oh, now let's ask, we've got an issue that touches on youth. so let's ask the young person. I mean, that's ridiculous. All of our trustees have been recruited for the skills that they bring, and they've all delivered on those skills in an amazing way. I'm super impressed by our board, actually. And just to make the obvious point, you know, we're a funder with an endowment, and you know, since we diversified our board massively, we're still going strong. And it's about creating a culture, as people said, about where you can ask questions, because there's a really interesting element around ethical investments and the management of endowments, which feels like a complex area, and an area where you need a lot of skills. And to a certain extent you do, but most of us are actually, we have you know, fund managers who are doing a lot of that work for us, and it's about challenging them and asking them questions. And I've learned a lot through that process myself, and through, as Segun said, through simplifying financial information has been a benefit to me. So a lot of the culture changes that you put in place to enable a more inclusive board, as people have said, actually supports everybody. And better governance generally, I would say.
Thank you, Jo. And I think that's one of the things we hear all the time is like, this feels so overwhelming. There is so much that I need to do. I need to ensure that my board is ready to thrive. I need to convince my board to get on board. I need to like figure out all of these new terms I've never heard before. And the key point is just starting and taking action now. And Jo, you've been a staff member at Blagrave for over 8 years, so you have that long-term perspective of someone who's gone along that journey. What would be your advice from speaking to yourself at the beginning of the journey in terms of just starting, and what impact do you think, with a long-term perspective, young trustees have had on future-proofing financial management and risk analysis?
So I think it's really important. It's ridiculous to suggest that young people kind of writ large have better skills in certain areas than any other generation, right? But it's also ridiculous to suggest that older people with decades of professional experience do. You know, both are kind of binary ideas, and both are untrue. But one thing I think where I think young people have a definite advantage, and in terms of giving advice, I think it's really important to convey this to people, is around this idea of future-proofing. I would describe it as maintaining our relevance. If you look at climate, if you look at racial justice, if you look at mental health issues, if you look at ethical investments, if you look at the impact of the pandemic, in other words, the big issues of the day that dominate, you know, our world right now, young people quite clearly bring a specific lens, urgency, focus, and perspective on those issues. And I really think, you know, that they have supported our understanding and thinking about how we respond, and understand those issues. I mean, I'm sure that if we hadn't changed our board, we could have gone years without having a conversation about climate. You know, the biggest and most urgent issue of the day, perhaps. And I think there are huge risks. Again, it's already been touched on. We live in a very divided time, and the pandemic has also really exemplified that, in terms of how young people have been affected by the pandemic and how older people have been affected by the pandemic completely differently in terms of social terms. And actually, if we don't, within the kind of field of social change, look at social cohesion and how we bring generations together to kind of come up with answers together, then I think we're missing a massive amount. And as Segun said, like, I'm absolutely sure that the trustees that we have enabled us to not be riskier per se, but certainly to think more boldly and be more innovative and more willing to try new things than perhaps we would have been. And that's been incredible. And I do definitely believe that our work is richer for it. So my advice to people who want to get trustees but don't really know how to go there or get their board on board is like get people like myself and young trustees mainly to come and speak to your boards, just to demystify the kind of fear that exists there for some reason, and be really pragmatic. And the main thing I'd say is you have to set young people up to succeed. Make sure your culture is ready for that. We're still learning. I don't claim we get it all right, but be absolutely clear about that. It's not just about what young people can give to you, but it's also a reciprocal arrangement, if you like.
Thank you, Jo and Segun. That was a really powerful case study, looking at the Blagrave Trust and seeing how the organisation has been transformed by young trustees. A lot of the questions that we've had have been around getting your board on board and creating those first steps. There are a lot of CEOs here on the call who are like, yes, I get it. How do I get my board on board? So I just wanted to share some top tips that we've had from boards and conversation and young people who've been speaking to us so far. So how do we get decision makers on board with meaningful change? Step one, clarity, the yes and. So as Jo just mentioned, you want to set young people up to succeed, and this can be potentially like a long journey in the conversations that was mentioned as well. So when you're trying to get decision makers on board, they might say to you, yes, but I'm a CEO and I'm 60 years old or 50 years old, and I found this like a really intimidating space to begin with. How are young people going to feel? And it's like, yes, and let's change the space to be more inclusive. Or I didn't have any training when I began. This is really hard to grapple with these issues. Yes, and let's create more transparency and innovate things in a more simplistic way in the ways that you've heard. Disruptive questioning. Sometimes people just need a question to slow down their thinking. Actually meeting young trustees, so as Jo said as well, sometimes just meeting young people are enough to disrupt the stereotypes that we have about young people. A lot of the times I hear from people initially, my granddaughter couldn't be a trustee, and it's like, cool, my grandma couldn't be a trustee. So when people have actually gone through this process, I remember a case study in particular where there was somebody who was adamantly against like what young people could possibly bring to their boards, and they started the recruitment process. And when they started doing some of the questions and Q&As, they the person who was most against having young trustees on board wanted to recruit 4 young people, and the person who was advocating for change was like, no, slow down, we only have a max of 2 spaces. And finally, creating expectation. Like, this diversity is not something to have sprinkled on the side. It is, for the reasons that we've mentioned, and the speakers that have spoken to you before, is an essential part of governance and a key part of what is needed now more than ever. So creating that expectation that this is vital and urgent, and change is needed to be had. We can also support you with a framework to take people on the journey to this. I'm more than, as was discussed, you don't have to do this on your own. There are so many people who've gone through this beforehand. I am more than happy to have a chat with anybody who wants to after this webinar to talk you through how you can support people to work through meaningfully engaging young people in a workshop, or how you engage them over coffee before you can even get to the workshop stage. And as was mentioned, please take action. This is, if we're waiting for the perfect answer, it's not going to happen. Be curious, ask those questions, do what is in your control now. So for instance, if what is in your control now is to just start the conversation, you can do that. You can also do mentoring. There is also going to be some great resources coming out by another brilliant person who is going to be sharing how they just started mentoring people who are not on boards typically, because they wanted to see that change just off their own backs. And then ask if there is any reason why you feel like you cannot take action, or if there is any barrier. We're kind of here to support you, and there are so many people who can do that. So please do ask if you feel unclear about taking action. And then finally, supporting innovation. So as funders, you have a huge influence on the rest rest of the sector. So if you are to share your commitment to recruit young trustees, it's going to have a ripple effect for the rest of the sector. Putting it on the agenda, I know a brilliant person in a conference, in a space when she meets with people, she says in the room, what organisations here have young trustees in the room, and literally ask them to put their hands up, and then also fund and support some of these initiatives, and training to support young people and people from on the sharp edge of exclusion to be able to have the voice and to innovate at the boards that we are in. We're now coming to the close of the webinar, and I'd like to say a huge thank you to everybody who has attended. By you choosing, everyone on this call is busy, and by you choosing to be here, you have chosen to prioritise this much needed and urgent issue that we need change on. So thank you for making the time to do this. This is the beginning of change that we are doing together, and we're here to support you through it. And collectively, you are part of a movement of people. So I'd really like to hear from all of our panelists, just one thing that you hope people will, in one sentence, what do you hope people take away from this webinar? And I am going to, if speakers could nominate each other, that would be great. I'm going to go to Osaro.
Get more young people, but also make sure you have different types of young people from different backgrounds, so diverse perspective of young people.
Over to you, Angus.
Yeah, I think for me, and I just want to thank the other panelists, because it's been great hearing these other stories. But I think the one thing I'd like everyone to take away is that there is masses to be gained, but very little to be lost. So as you say, just something is better than nothing.
Thank you, Afshan.
To take Stormzy's lyric, take that fee and treble it twice, to either have multiple people from the same identity type, or to pay that one person that you've put all that burden of representation on double the fee.
Also, side note, just so you know, you can pay young people to be trustees if it helps diversify your board. So a lot of people don't know that, and it's particularly helpful for people who can't afford to take time off work. But that's a side note from me. Jo Wells.
Just trust your instincts and trust young people. The kind of young people that want to be trustees are pretty amazing. And also plug to the Young Trustees movement. There's so much resource and support there. All these questions can be answered by them.
Thank you. And Segun?
Yeah, I would just say change is the only thing that's constant, they say. So just if you're not changing, then yeah, just if this is one part of the board that bring change by bringing on young trustees, then yeah, then do that.
That is so beautifully said, Segun, and I think a great note to end the webinar on, particularly because by doing this, by diversifying your board in this way, it is going to innovate and not only give you all the incredible insights that intergenerational and more diverse boards bring, but also it helps you innovate governance more widely in the process of doing this. So I'm really actually excited, if you don't have a board with young trustees, the exciting journey that you're about to go on and leading the sector into. Thank you so much for making the time to be here today. We are going to be following up with a follow-up blog to answer all of your questions. We've had some incredible questions, so thank you so much for being here. It makes a huge difference. If there is any reason you feel you cannot take a next step by the end of today, please ask it as a question. You have my contact details. Get in touch, and we look forward to making change with you, because only with you can we create change. Thank you so much, and have a great lunch.